So today we're going to read Brian's Return by Gary Paulsen. We read Chapter 1. Brian sat quietly, taken by a peace he had not known for a long time, and let the canoe drift forward along the lily pads. To his right was the shoreline of a small lake he had flown into an hour earlier. Around him was the lake itself, an almost circular body of water for approximately 8 acres, surrounded by northern forest, pine, spruce, poplar, and birch, and thick brush. It was late spring, June 3rd to be exact, and the lake was teeming, crawling, buzzing, and flying with life. Mosquitoes and flies filled the air, swarming on him, and he smiled now, remembering the first horror at the small blood drinkers. In the middle of the canoe he had an old coffee can with some kindling inside, and a bit of birch bark, and he lit them and dropped a handful of green poplar leaves on the tiny fire. Soon smoke billowed out and drifted back and forth across the canoe, and the insects left him. He had repellent with him this time, along with nearly 200 pounds of other gear, but he hated the smell of it, and he found it didn't work as well as the touch of a smoke now and then. The black flies and the deer flies and the horse flies ignored repellent completely. He swore they seemed to lick it off, but they hated the smoke and stayed well off the canoe. The relief gave him time to see the rest of the activity on the lake. He remained still, watching, listening. To his left rear he heard a beaver slap the water with its tail and dive, a warning at the intruder, at the strange smoking log holding that person. Brian smiled. He had come to know beaver for what they truly were, engineers, a family-oriented home builder. He read that most of the cities in Europe were founded by beaver, that beaver had first felled the trees along the rivers and dammed them up. The rising water killed more trees, and when the food was gone, the beaver had no more bark to chew. They left. The dams eventually broke apart, and the water drained and left large clearings along the rivers where the beaver had cut down all the trees. Early man came along and started cities where the clearings lay. Cities like London and Paris were founded and settled first by beaver. In front and to the right he heard the heavier footsteps of a deer moving through the hazel brush. Probably a buck, because he heard no smaller footsteps of a fawn. A buck with its antlers in velvet, more than likely, moving away from the smell of smoke from the canoe. A frog jumped from a lily pad 6 feet away and had barely entered the water when a northern pike took it with a splashing strike that tore the surface of the lake and then flipped the lily pads over to show their pale undersides. Somewhere a hawk screamed, and he looked for it, but he could not see it through the leaves of the trees around the lake. It would be for hunting, bringing some mice for a nest full of young, looking for something to kill. No, Brian thought, not in that way. The hawk did not hunt to kill, it hunted to eat. Of course it had to kill to eat, along with all other carnivorous animals. But the killing was with the means to bring food, not the end. Only man hunted for sport, for trophies. It is the same with me as with the hawk, Brian felt. He turned the paddle edgeways and eased forward silently, pulled back with an even stroke. I will kill to eat or to defend myself, but no other reason. In the past 2 years, except for the time with Derek on the river, in a kind, lonely agony, he had tried to find things to read or watch that brought the woods to him. He missed the forest, the lakes, and the wild as he thought of it, so much that at times he could not bear it. The guns and hunting magazines, the hunting and fishing videos on television sickened him. Men using high-velocity weapons to shoot deer or elk from so far away they could barely see them, or worse, blasting them from a blind or the back of a jeep, baiting bear with bits full of rotten meat and shooting them with rifles that could stop a car, taking bass for sport or money in huge contests with fancy boats and electronic gear that located each fish individually. Sport, they called it, but they weren't hunting, fishing because they needed to. They were not killing to kill, or they were killing to kill, not eat, to prove some kind of worth. And he stopped reading the magazines and watching the videos. His survival in the wilderness had made him famous in a small way, and some of the magazines interviewed him, as did some of the hunting and sporting shows on television. But they got it all wrong, completely wrong. Boy conquers savage wilderness, some magazines said in the blurb on the cover. Learns to beat nature. It wasn't that way. Had never been that way. Brian hadn't conquered anything. Nature had whipped him, not the other way around. Had beaten him down and pounded the stupidity out of his brain until he had been forced to bend Forced to give, forced to learn to survive. He had learned the most important fact of all, the one that is so hard for many people to understand or believe. Man proposes, nature disposes. He hadn't conquered nature at all. He had become part of it, and it had become a part of him, maybe all of him. And that, he thought, as the canoe slid gently forward, had been exactly the problem. I hope you all are using your imagination to make the pictures, because there's no pictures in this book.